Hey, everybody out there in Facebook land on the Positively Dad Facebook page. It's James Shaw, excited to chat with you. You know, this is what we do when we're recording our podcast episodes whenever possible. We just live stream it on the Facebook page so that you don't have to wait for me to flip it around and turn it into a podcast. And so that's what we're doing today. So you're watching live, and yet this will become a podcast here soon. And I'm excited to bring in our guest today, Dr. Karey O'Hara from Arizona State. And thank you for doing this with us. You have some important research that you and your team have done about divorce and about how, you know, the conflict maybe between the parents and the impact on the kids. I mean, there's a lot to unpack. And so, you know, we're not necessarily talking pink fluffy unicorns today, and yet we're talking something really, really important. So thanks so much for being with us and joining us on Positively Dad.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you. I'm glad that you're interested in the research. I'm happy to talk about it. One of the important things for me is to get the research out into the world so that people can benefit from it.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So just tell us real quick a little bit about you and what you do, and then we'll get into our conversation.
Okay, great.
Whoops.
There we go.
No, you're there. You're back. My fault. Keep going.
No problem at all. So I am an assistant research professor at Arizona State University. I work in the Department of Psychology. And I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, but I spend most of my time doing research these days. Broadly speaking, I study the effects of separation and divorce on children's mental health. That's the primary focus of my work. I do a few other things, but that's really the focus. And my work involves looking at existing data that we have collected in other studies and trying to answer questions like the one that we're going to talk about today. And then a large part of my work at this point is working on interventions, so we can figure out how to help families get through the separation and divorce and really help their kids adjust well and get everyone through that transition in a way that protects and promotes the well-being of kids.
Yeah, well, it's an important topic, and one that you have some specific research about dads too that we'll talk about in a second. And yet what stood out to me, this is what the study says. When you read this, you go, oh my gosh, this is horrible. We need to make our marriage work. I mean, this is the first sentence right here from Arizona State in their article. Conflict between divorced or separated parents increases the risk of children developing physical and mental health problems. So now you found this in the research, and yet what you're not saying is, well, then stick together. There are ways that if your marriage is not working out and you need to move on, there are ways you can do it that don't harm your kids in this way, that don't cause challenges, right?
Yes, absolutely, James. You are absolutely correct. I mean, one of the biggest things that we know, researchers and clinicians have been interested in this for decades. Divorce and separation is not new. When the first research started coming out, it was all bad news. It was, kids don't do well. This raises risk for mental health problems, academic problems, social problems, all across the board. And, when you look at the research, when you look at a really high level, just at groups, children who experience the separation or divorce of their parents, they are at higher risk for mental health problems and physical health problems. That's true. But what's much more interesting about that story is that there's so much variability. Kids have all sorts of outcomes with divorce, and that got us really curious. What does that mean? Why are some kids doing really well? Some kids even do better after separation. Why are some kids not doing well? And so I would say over the past 3 decades or so, we've really been focused on figuring out that why and how. How can we protect kids? Because we know that this is going to happen, and we also know that staying together for the kids is not the best advice without some nuance either. So it's really gotten a lot of attention over the last several years, probably 2 or 3 decades now, figuring out, okay, who's at risk, why are they at risk, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, well, that's what we've got to learn about. So let's take it in chunks. Let's kind of go chronologically. Okay. So let's start with, you said staying together for the kids. Like if that's the reason, you've moved beyond, and this is not a should you or should you not get divorced conversation. This is a, look, you're on that path, and sometimes some parents go, nope, we're going to stick it out through the kids, and then the day after they graduate from high school, we're Splitsville or whatever. And you're going, here's what I'm hearing, that you're not necessarily recommending that if you're on that path of divorce. So talk with us a little bit about maybe why that's not a great thing to stay together for the kids.
Yeah. It's a great question. And when that early research came out and it was so much bad news, it scared a lot of parents. It's a reasonable conclusion to think, okay, well, if divorce is so bad for kids, then we should just stick it out for them. But what I like to say is divorce is not bad for kids. What's bad for kids is what happens during the divorce. If they are exposed to a lot of stressors, divorce is stressful. That's the way it is. It's stressful for parents, it's stressful for kids. There's a lot of changes. Really important decisions need to be made about who's going to live where and what school we're going to go to and all those sorts of things. So it can be stressful. But the extent to which that parents can protect kids from that stress or help buffer them from the stress that comes with the divorce makes all of the difference in the world. And one of the stressors that I focus on the most is conflict. That's something we're going to talk a lot about today because that's what this study was about. And really, it's the bulk of the research that I do is figuring out, why is conflict so bad for kids and how does that play out in the divorce situation?
Well, and let's be honest, if we're getting divorced, there's probably going to be conflict. There's going to be disagreements. There's going to be challenges with that. And what your research showed is conflict stresses kids out. And if not handled in the right way is what I think you're going to tell us, and can cause some challenges. And one thing it says is, depending on the type of conflict and how that interaction goes, there could be some fears, like your child may go, am I going to get abandoned? Am I going to get left behind? So tell us a little bit about that part of your study, that what conflict that's observed by, or I guess even that you let the kids participate in conflict at times, what that could lead to and why we want to be careful of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So conflict, what we're talking about conflict, because as you said, you are right on the money. Look, people are getting separated or divorced for a reason. There's conflict. That's normal. That's part of the process. So we're certainly not saying, get divorced with absolutely no conflict. That's not reasonable. But let me tell you what I'm talking about. When we talk about the conflict that's harmful for kids, we're talking about conflict that's frequent. It's happening a lot. That's really intense. That's, there's a lot of strong emotion. Parents are being hostile to each other or yelling at each other, staying mad for a long time. Conflict that goes unresolved, there's a big blow up and then we just go on until the next big blow up. There's no resolution to the conflict. One reason that conflict can get particularly challenging for kids in the situation of separation and divorce is that oftentimes the conflict becomes much more child-centered. So the parents might be arguing about things like custody, about child support, about where the kid's going to go to school, about what soccer team they can play on or not play on. So when the conflict starts becoming what we call really child-centered, that's the conflict that's particularly hard for kids. So when we measure conflict in our research, we're looking at frequency, intensity. We're also look at a couple of other things. So we think about, when people think about conflict, they often think about arguing, fighting, that sort of thing. And that's true. We call that, overt types of conflict. You can see it, you can hear it. But there's also types of that are a little bit more covert that are also really hard for kids. Particularly in the situation of separation and divorce. So in this study, not only did we define conflict as frequent and intense fighting and arguing, we also measured something called caught in the middle. Children feeling like they're really caught in the middle of the conflict. And this can be hard because it's sometimes not quite, it's not super obvious. It can kind of sneak up on you. So this involves things like a child being caught in the middle of an argument for sure, but also, if parents are asking kids questions about what happens at the other parent's house, asking them to sort of act as a spy, if you will. Was mom dating anyone new? Who did you see when you were at mom? You were at dad's house, that sort of thing. It can also be when kids are asked to pass messages. So, tell your dad.
That's what I was going to ask about. Yeah, I want to ask about that part specifically, because I feel like, when I'm hanging out with other parents and my wife and I have, friends that are divorced, I hear some of that of, you got to tell your dad that blah, 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 or tell mom that this or that, or, I can't do that. Your mom knows that, like that sort of thing. And it seems kind of innocent and maybe in the moment. And yet I guess it could lead to some issues.
Yeah. And you're right. I like how you put that, because parents don't mean to be putting their kids in the middle. It happens often without even noticing it, but kids certainly notice it. So definitely the passing the messages, feeling like you're caught in the middle, it can lead to things like loyalty conflicts, having to pick sides, that sort of thing. So there's a real range of behaviors that can make kids feel caught in the middle, but when they feel caught in the middle, it's hard for them. And then the other thing that's related to that I'm particularly interested in is bad mouthing, what we call bad mouthing. When a parent says something negative about the other parent, that's really hard for kids. And you can imagine that, from the child's perspective, they're thinking, well, if dad's bad, am I bad? They see themselves as an extension of their parents. And so when someone's saying really nasty, negative things about a parent, it's hard for kids. It really can get to them. And so those are the major things, putting the kids in the middle, asking them to, act as a messenger or a spy. Even something simple like a good example would be, what did you have for dinner at mom's house?
I was just thinking that. What did they pack you for lunch today? Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's, it's much more nuanced, but I think that's something that we don't talk about enough. Typically when we talk about conflict, people automatically think fighting, arguing. And yes, that's hard for kids, but it's not the only part of it.
So that's a good observation and a good thing to note, that if you are either divorced or going through that, to keep in mind that even the smallest little thing for your kid, and in part, I guess, really because the relationship between a child and a parent is different between spouses or partners that are moving on. That's a different type of relationship. And so they look at their parents, in probably most cases, someone they love and care about and they trust and they want to feel close to, and yet the separation's happening. So there's some confusion there. You said that in the study, you said that, like, depending on, and I want to make sure I get this right, there could be a difference depending on how close that parent-child relationship is. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this study, the major research question that we wanted to tackle here is we wanted to know, how does exposure to conflict predict children's fears of abandonment? We know that fear of abandonment is a particularly salient thought, emotion, fear that kids have in this situation. So we thought we want to understand, if they're exposed to conflict, does that make it more likely that they're going to fear that they're going to be abandoned by one or both parents? And then in turn, does that predict their mental health problems? So that was our first research question. But the second research question was, okay, if there's this association between exposure to conflict and fear of abandonment, does it matter what the relationship quality looks like? Maybe, we thought, well, if the child has a really strong relationship with their parent, maybe that will protect them. Maybe that will buffer them from feeling this fear of abandonment in the face of conflict. And we were surprised to find that that was not the case here. When children were exposed to high levels of conflict, they were more likely to report this fear of abandonment. And when we looked at the full sample, it didn't matter whether the children had a great relationship with their parent or not so great. It did not make a difference. That association was there. We got really curious about this, and our next question was, okay, well, does it matter if that relationship quality, the parent-child relationship quality, if it's a father or a mother? Because we had this large sample where we had, a large number of kids in the sample who had their parent, who had their father, they were reporting on their relationship with their father and with their mother. And so we looked at those sort of subsamples of our study. And when we looked at moms, we found the same pattern as the overall sample. More exposure to conflict predicted higher fears of abandonment. So same story there. But when we looked at the dads, we found something really interesting. We found that relationship quality, father-child relationship quality, actually did make a difference. And even more interestingly, it made a difference for better and for worse. So what I mean by that is that it really depended on the level of conflict. So when children reported a really great relationship with dad, high, relatively high in the sample, they showed the same pattern as the whole sample. More exposure to conflict, higher fears of abandonment if they had that great relationship with dad. For the kids who reported that they had a mediocre relationship with dad or a not so great relationship with dad, that association actually wasn't there. So that was really interesting to us. It's not that the high relationship, the great relationship actually protected them. In fact, that association was there. So I say for better or for worse, because when you look at the pattern across the relationship or across the sample, what you see is that for those kids who had a really great relationship with their dad and it was a low conflict separation or divorce, they had the lowest levels of fear of abandonment. They really benefited from that great relationship with dad. That's not surprising, right? Dads are important. We know that.
Well, we got to unpack this for a second. The higher the quality of the relationship with dad, the less likely they would feel abandoned in this kind of split of a relationship. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it depended on the conflict. So if they had, it's also all three things matter basically. So if they had a great relationship with dad and they were exposed to low conflict, they had low fear of abandonment. But
that's amazing.
That's the better part. The worse part is the opposite. If they had a great relationship with dad and they were in a high conflict situation, they had the highest fears of abandonment.
Interesting. So the more so than mom. So they could be in there could be high conflict. They have a high relationship with the mom and there's high conflict. They would have this sense of abandonment, and yet if they had a high quality relationship with dad and there was high conflict, that was even elevated. Is that what you're saying?
We didn't compare those levels of fear of abandonment between mothers and fathers. We just looked at the association.
Got it.
So really, it's more like for conflict was related to fear of abandonment, and it really did. The relationship with mom really didn't matter. It was always there. It was conflict.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So I got to ask you then. So you're saying if I don't have a great relationship with dad, and there's divorce and there's conflict and whatever, like there was really no change in my feeling of abandonment. Is that because we already feel abandoned?
That's a great guess. I don't know in this case.
See, now all you guys, if it says PhD next to your name, you'll always just say it's a good guess, except I don't know. So and yet we can infer, right? We can infer.
I think it's a great hypothesis. Yes.
Yeah,
I think that on the flip side, it's not surprising to me that kids who have great relationships with dad would have this fear of abandonment in the face of high conflict, because if you think about it, they have a lot to lose. If you have a great relationship with dad after a separation or divorce, that's precious, right? And if you're also being exposed to a lot of conflict, I mean, it's not, you think about this from a child's perspective, it might not be likely that they're going to be abandoned, but it's not improbable, right? They've already seen the dissolution of their parents' relationship. So it follows that they might think, well, maybe I'm going to be abandoned next.
Well, their whole life, right? Their whole life. I'm a product of a divorced family, right? The whole life looks different. Now we got multiple bedrooms. I got to have clothes over here. There's a lot of change for somebody to go through and to wonder, am I next or whatever. It's great stuff. Okay, so now that we've talked about that, we got to talk then, what do parents do? And again, this is not the podcast on should you work to keep the marriage together or not. We're assuming in this case, you've gone through all of that and you've made the decision that you've got to move on for everyone's health and well-being. And so you go do that. So now what are the practical steps to make sure that you can keep your kids' world as good and positive and not cause some of these challenges? What tips would you give?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just say one thing about, before we get to the tips, which is my favorite thing to talk about. This is why I turned my research into intervention, because I just love for parents to make this difference. But let me touch on one thing that you said first in terms of, not deciding whether or not to get divorced. One thing that parents should know is that that conflict is powerful. So we also know, not from my research, but from prior research, that actually kids who stayed in a high conflict marriage were worse off than the kids whose parents got divorced if the conflict went down. So it's really about the conflict and what happens in the family, not necessarily about the separation or divorce. I started by saying I am to say that divorce is bad. How you get divorced matters. How you are married really matters. So I think that that's important.
Yeah. So if you have high conflict, even though you're staying together, it could still not be good. So you might want to move on. And the other thing, though, too, I want to make sure it's not just getting divorced. I mean, you could have people who just are living together, they're cohabitating, and there's a separation. I mean, it's any kind of separation like that could have the impact. So that's interesting to know.
Thank you for highlighting that. That's very important.
Yeah, well, give us the tips then, because I think this is what happens. I don't know what the percentage is. I did see I saw two different studies. One said divorces are up in the pandemic, and the other one said divorces are down in the pandemic. So who knows what the truth is?
Yeah, I don't think we have good data yet. But
right. So what are the tips?
So let me tell you what parents can do. First of all, parents should know that they are incredibly powerful. What they do during the separation and divorce process can help their children immensely. It can make a huge difference, and actually that difference can last for decades. We can talk about that if you're interested, but we have some longitudinal studies showing that when parents are reducing conflict, when they're bolstering that relationship with their children during separation and divorce, they can have positive effects for years to come. So that's the most important thing that parents know, is you have the power to help your children through this. So the big thing is reducing the conflict. Protect your kids from that conflict. One thing that we often tell parents in our interventions is we say, picture in your mind a protective shield. And every time your kids are around and there's this opportunity for conflict, just picture putting up that shield. You are shielding them from that conflict. And it's important to remember that kids can pick up on it, right? So if you're arguing on the phone, if you think they're in a different room, they can hear you, they can feel it. So really try to protect that. Have those conversations. Look, as you said in the beginning, conflict is inevitable. It's going to happen. You're getting divorced or separating. There are important decisions to be made. Conflict is normal and expected, but have those conversations when your kids are not around. They can't hear you and they can't be affected by that. Really shield them from it. The more you can reduce that conflict, the better. Be really careful not to put them in the middle, not to say anything bad about the other parent. One thing I like to tell parents is I think, based on our research, that the best gift that you can give your child is permission to love their other parent. And not only permission, but support. You want them to have a good relationship with both of you. It's huge. So those are the big ones: reducing the conflict, reducing the extent to which you put your kids in the middle or badmouth the other parent, or other people badmouthing the other parent. If you have friends or family, ask them politely, please don't say those things to my child about their dad or about their mom. That's really important. So those, I think, are the biggest things. Relationship quality matters, but what we know from this study is that it doesn't cancel out the negative effects of conflict. So you really have to do both. You got to bolster that relationship, but reduce the conflict.
So that was my question. Let's say someone's listening to this and they go, okay, we need a reset, right?
Yes.
That we have gone down the wrong path on this. I've badmouthed my former partner. I've done whatever. And so I want to reset. How would a parent approach that, to reset, to correct maybe some of the stuff that they just didn't realize could be harmful?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say, start today. Make a difference. Make those behavioral changes. It's not too late. With regard to sort of repairing what's already been done, I think it's important to reassure your child. This study that we did would suggest that children are more likely to have fears of abandonment if there's a lot of conflict. So take that time to reassure your child. Even though your dad and I or your mom and I are getting divorced, we will always love you. We will always be there for you. You are going to be taken care of. Make sure they know that. They might need to hear that a few times. Reassure them that you're there for them. That can make a huge difference. The other thing I'll say is that there's some newer research coming out that talks about resolution. So when you can resolve the conflict or show your child, and this is true for parents in married families too, conflict is not necessarily bad for kids. In fact, it can be a good socialization to how to resolve, conflict resolution. So resolve that conflict, apologize. You don't have to get back together, but you can say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. To make a resolution, that really helps calm children and calm their fears.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, you said if through a separation and then after, if you can keep conflict really low, and that it can make a difference long term.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Make a difference. Yeah, so my colleagues at Arizona State University have been studying an intervention program. It's called the New Beginnings program. They've been studying it for over 2 decades now. And what they find is that when parents went through this New Beginnings program, this was back in the 90s, they, 12-session program, they learned things like keeping their kids out of the middle of conflicts, bolstering their relationship with their children, those sorts of things. Those kids whose parents went through this program were doing better in terms of mental health, substance use, academic functioning, social, peers, getting along with their peers, any outcome that we care about as psychologists and as parents, they were doing better. And those effects held at a 6-year follow-up. They held at a 15-year follow-up. These kids are now young adults. And actually, we're collecting data now on a 26-year follow-up to see if it's actually impacting the next generation. So when I say that parenting is powerful, that's what I mean.
Well, because ultimately, while the marriage may not have worked out, we want our kids to grow up with a great life and a sense of belonging and believing that they can accomplish whatever they want. And little tiny things, even like, what did you have for dinner last night? Like, was it good for you, or did you go through the drive-through? Like, even that little thing can have an impact. So creating the awareness can really help your kids grow up to be the people that you want them to be. This is fascinating stuff. What is kind of the take-home message? And think for our audience, think for dads. What is as they listen to this, and we'll wrap up, we got dads listening who aren't divorced. This is not on their radar. They're happily married. They're going to be married forever, and yet there's still a take-home message for them. What is it?
Yeah. I think the take-home message is what you do in terms of your relationship with your child and your relationship with your child's other parents. So with the conflict, like we talked about before, it doesn't matter if you're divorced or married. If you reduce the conflict that your children are exposed to, that will protect them. And also that relationship quality. I don't know that parents realize that the power that they have, and how, high quality parent-child relationships is like the most protective factor that we have. You see it across family structures, divorce, separated, married, cohabitating, all of it. So I think the take-home message is invest in those relationships with your children. Have quality time with them, listen to them, try to understand what they're feeling, those sorts of things. And then protect them from the conflict, because you know that's stressful for them. And like I said, I'll say one more time because I think it's so important for parents who are going through a divorce. The most precious gift you can give your children is permission and support to love their other parent, and to support that relationship. One caveat, of course, is if the other relationship, if there's safety issues, that's another situation.
Right.
But even so, even in that situation, you can still not badmouth that other parent. You can talk to your kids about the situation in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're bad because they perceive their parent to be bad.
Good stuff. Dr. O'Hara, thank you so much for sharing this with us today. Thank you for the research and all you're doing to help families. And thanks for being on Positively Dad. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much. I was so happy to be in here and join you today.